Ladies and gentlemen, members of the floor, before we begin the Ideas Liberalism Conference in 2021, allow me to make just a very short and brief housekeeping announcement. At the Institute for Democracy and Economic Affairs, Malaysia, we are committed to provide a safe environment for all parties, both internal and external, to work together. Ideas has a policy of zero tolerance towards sexual exploitation and abuse. Everyone here today is responsible for making this event a safe space for a public discourse. With that, ladies and gentlemen, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. A very pleasant morning and a very warm welcome I wish to all distinguished guests, speakers and panelists, and all Ideas friends and followers to Ideas Annual Liberalism Conference for 2021. Our special welcome goes to Yang Amat Mulia Tunku Zain Al-Abidin Ibni Tuanku Muhriz, the chairman for Ideas Board of Directors, as well as the berbahagia Dato Sri Nazir bin Tun Haji Abdul Razak, chairman and founding partner of Ikhlas Capital. Ladies and gentlemen, for your information, Ideas Liberalism Conference is an annual event which aims to actually expand policy discourses and critical discussions for the process of nation building in Malaysia. This is where Ideas would have its opportunity to engage with various policymakers across the country as well as around the world to look into the issues and challenges that we have as a nation and what could possibly be done as an offering to a better solution for our country. And this 2021 particularly is kind of like a unique situations. While the country is seeing its process towards recovering from the pandemic COVID-19 and now has changed into the endemic, it gives us actually an opportunity to look back and to reflect for the past 2 years, what has changed in the country when it comes to democratizations and economic liberalizations, what shifts has probably been created, what realignment that has probably been constructed throughout these 2 years while we as a country weather COVID-19. And this year's conference with the theme, The Fate of Liberal Democracy in Turbulent Times, is very timely actually. As I said before, is for us to look back the progress of democracy, the progress of economic liberalizations in our country when it comes to COVID-19. So we will see whether there is a shift, whether there is a realignment, whether there are changes and challenges for the past 2 years, and how we can move forward as a nation for 2022 and beyond. So for your information as well, in the posters we have circulated around, there are 3 special breakout sessions that we have arranged and we have coordinated, arranging all of these various good speakers to talk about politics. We will be talking about post-Sheraton, the breakdown of trust and fragility of parliamentary democracy. Tomorrow, we'll be talking about on the economics, where we will be looking at the rise of state intervention in weathering the economics of COVID-19, as well as we are going to talk about the social aspect of COVID-19 vaccination, balancing personal liberty and community interest. So these are the constructive or the hot juicy topics that we'll be together exploring for today and tomorrow. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, I have the honor to present to you Yang Amat Mulia Tunku Zain Al-Abidin Ibni Tuanku Muhriz, the chairman of Ideas Board of Directors, to give his opening remarks. Over to you, Tunku.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zokri, and Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. And a very good morning to everybody. Thank you for joining us today at this 6th edition of the Ideas Liberalism Conference. I know that with borders opening up, with there being tourism bubbles, all of you have many options in choosing how to spend your Saturday morning. So thank you for logging in to yet another online conference. I hope that my colleagues at Ideas, together with the spectacular lineup of speakers today and tomorrow, will make it worthwhile for you. Describing oneself as liberal, or even mentioning the word liberalism in a good light, has long been difficult in Malaysia. In the past few weeks alone, we have seen how supporting certain policies or taking certain stances on what really should be trivial issues can trigger derogatory accusations of being liberal. And it has become a catch-all insult that posits the accused as the opposite of the accuser, who by implication is right and virtuous. Unfortunately, such derision does make an impact on our politics and our public policy making. It makes sensible and intelligent people compete to show their parochialism, to outdo themselves in narrow identity politics, and to abandon science and evidence in favor of using whatever means necessary to protect and advance their chosen target group. It was not, of course, always like this. In the early days of Malaya and then Malaysia, the Prime Minister had no qualms about being described as liberal. And even in the 1960s, Utusan Malaysia approvingly described the alliance, the Perikatan Manifesto, as promising a liberal society. But perhaps the most famous remnant of a different attitude towards the word liberal, which has survived to this day and is repeated every year at National Day celebrations, is in the preamble of the Rukun Negara, our national principles as formulated by the National Consultative Council, headed by Tun Abdul Razak, and instituted by royal proclamation on the 31st of August, 1970. And in that preamble, it says that we guarantee a liberal approach towards Malaysia's rich and varied cultural traditions. Later, in 1991, Challenge 5 of Vision 2020 hoped to establish a mature, liberal, and tolerant society. And that remains a challenge. But while these examples may be well known, I want to share that just 2 weeks ago, I officiated an inaugural international conference on liberal studies. And this was not organized by a foreign or private university, but rather by University Kebangsaan Malaysia, UKM, the National University of Malaysia, an institution that sprang from Malay intellectual activism and had Tun Abdul Razak as its first chancellor. Not many in the audience might be aware that UKM actually offers a Bachelor of Science in Liberal Studies. And although the term liberal studies has its own particular meaning in academia, it is nonetheless significant that a leading public university is helping to detoxify the word in Malaysia. But this weekend's conference concerns the fate of liberal democracy in turbulent times, not just in our country, but throughout the world. If in Malaysia, liberalism is controversial for its supposed hostility to preferential policies based on race and religion, in many other parts of the world, the word is now loathed for its perceived complicity with the many systemic failures and institutional weaknesses in supposedly democratic and capitalist societies. Responses to COVID-19 in the past 2 years have supplied much fodder for those who take contrarian views. Authoritarians might argue that centralized power enabled quick and decisive action to contain the virus and enforce vaccinations, while Democrats might argue that it is institutions working together which succeeded in garnering that essential public confidence towards the same goals. Then again, a look at the statistics of COVID deaths in proportion to the population will yield a range of results across countries, regardless of their political system. Obviously, there are many other variables at play: the country's geography, existing infrastructure and healthcare capacity, socioeconomic factors, and also how key decision makers are influenced by science and how much weight they place on political, economic, or populist concerns. In some countries, we have seen how a skepticism of science has dovetailed with a lack of trust in national institutions, giving fuel to conspiracy theories. Predictably, when scientists and officials attempt to debunk these theories, this is taken as precisely as proof of conspiracy, further widening the gulf. I'm sure all of us have received viral WhatsApp messages alleging the dangers of certain vaccines, supposed evil beneficiaries of vaccinations, and all manner of interesting alternative treatments. In the short term, some may argue that ostracizing these people may be a necessary step so as to safeguard the wider public interest. But in the long term, the proper remedy for liberal democracies is to rebuild trust in institutions so that citizens can feel that what their government, parliament, health ministry, and other government agencies are doing are actually in the best interest of the people rather than the best interest of the people in power. It is precisely because there is proven corruption on so many levels that people are able to cast aspersions on mass vaccination programs. It is precisely because so much money has already been stolen by politicians that citizens will allege money is being stolen in efforts to combat COVID. It is precisely because previous policies, especially those pursued during an emergency where transparency was greatly diminished, that have been seen to hurt so many people that the Rakyat are skeptical of a parliament which does not scrutinize as aggressively as it should. So is there anything to be optimistic about? I think there can be, if you look at some movements that have occurred despite the pandemic and political turbulence. In terms of institutional reforms, parliamentary select committees are now a permanent part of our democratic life. As I have argued, this is important in giving backbench members of parliament a role that is beyond simply obeying the orders of party leaders. The resources available to MPs and also aduns in some state legislative assemblies are now more equal across party lines than ever before in our history. A bigger game changer is, of course, Undi 18, and automatic voter registration, which should significantly change how political parties approach voters. Voters who, as we have seen, will never again be scared of voting for the opposition, whoever that may be at that particular point in time. Over the years, one key component in achieving these reforms is the ever-growing strength of civil society. Ideas turns 12 next year, and I'm proud of the many research papers, advocacy events, and even occasional controversies that have occurred that have helped push the needle on various aspects of reform. But we in turn have been joined and challenged by many partners in an increasingly competitive space of research, advocacy, and activism. This is in itself a core ingredient of a democracy, one that operates alongside the constitutionally provided mechanisms of government and parliament, one that bridges political parties to civil service and the corporate sector, one that is able to provide a platform for very different proposals to be aired without the fear of political retribution. But for me in recent times, perhaps the greatest validator of freedom and trusting people is the Hospital Emergency Fund that IDEA's charitable arm worked on with Project Bangsa Malaysia. Over the last few months, ordinary Malaysians have contributed 2 million ringgit towards the provision of oxygen tanks and concentrators, pumps, monitors, beds, blankets, stethoscopes, masks, and other medical equipment to 11 hospitals in the Klang Valley so that doctors and nurses are able to save lives. You may remember seeing a widely circulated video of frontliners anonymously sharing their frustrations in needing more support. This was the result. Ladies and gentlemen, of course, not all areas of public policy will be as equally emotive or so unanimously supported. I am sure Dato Sri Nazir Razak will touch on some of these areas in his keynote speech after this, and I eagerly look forward to reading his upcoming autobiography. This afternoon, Ira Azhari will moderate a session with Dr. Sebastian Detman, Dr. Amrita Malhi, and Dr. Sophie Lemiere on the breakdown of trust and fragility of parliamentary democracy post-Sheraton move. Tomorrow morning, Sri Murniati Yusuf will moderate Nadia Jalil, Hafiz Noor Shams, and Dr. Carmelo Felito in a panel on the rise of state intervention in weathering the economics of COVID-19. Our final session tomorrow afternoon will see Trisha Yeo moderate Dr. Korsi Keng, Dato Dr. Hatini Zainuddin, and Dato Professor Dr. Adiba Kamarul Zaman on the balance of personal liberty and community interest in the matter of COVID-19 vaccinations. The answers may not be always clear, but for those of us who still believe in the federal constitution and our Rukun Negara, it is vital that we try and seek the answers according to the intended vision of our democracy. If we don't do that, we may spiral into the irreversible abyss of illiberalism. I wish you all an enjoyable and illuminating conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ya Amat Mulia Tunku, for the insightful opening remarks on a lovely, bright Saturday. Without further ado, I would like to invite Yang Berbahagia Datuk Sri Nazir bin Tun Haji Abdul Razak, the chairman and founding partner of Ikhlas Capital, to deliver the keynote speech. Yang Berbahagia Datuk Sri will also willing to take a few questions depending on the time situations that we have. So if you do have any questions resulting from Datuk Sri's speech, please air it out in the chat box and we will share it accordingly. With that, ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Yang Berbahagia Datuk Sri Nazir bin Tun Haji Abdul Razak. Over to you, Datuk Sri.
Thank you, Dr. Zukri. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. It is, ladies and gentlemen, an absolute privilege to be given the opportunity to present the keynote address today. The theme of this conference, the fate of liberal democracy in turbulent times, is timely, and the lineup of panelists is excellent. My compliments to Tunku, Abidin, Trisha, and the team at Ideas. And Tunku, thank you also for that little plug for my book that is coming out on November the 8th. Ladies and gentlemen, to say that Malaysians are frustrated by never-ending political shenanigans is quite frankly an understatement. To have only voted once and yet had 4 different prime ministers in 4 years is exhausting at the best of times. The fact that it happened mostly during a very deadly pandemic and the concomitant social and economic crisis is simply tragic. There is no doubt that Malaysians suffered more from COVID-19 because of our politics, be it the initial distractions of the Sheraton move, the fragility of the government's majority giving rise to suboptimal appointments to pivotal positions, the perceived double standards on enforcement of MCO rules, or the Sabah political crisis that necessitated a state election. And quite unbelievably, we are staring at the likelihood of another state election in Malacca soon. If all this isn't enough, then we can also bring in the fact that we had a period of emergency rule during which the pandemic just seemed to get worse. We are the only country, to my knowledge, to have had a suspension of liberal democracy as a means of coping with the pandemic. When I first heard the announcement, I felt queasy. I didn't expect anything to change per se, but just the idea that we were being ruled by decree and that parliamentary oversight over the executive was gone brought me severe discomfort. I was immensely relieved when emergency rule came to an end. As Churchill once said, democracy is the worst form of government except for all others that have been tried. I subscribe to that view. It is, however, a view that has been losing popularity in recent times. The 2017 Pew survey of 38 countries reported that 52% of respondents were not satisfied with the way democracy was working in their countries, with a substantial number willing to consider non-democratic alternatives, even in such countries as Canada, United States, Sweden, Australia, and Japan. Larry Diamond, senior fellow at the Hoover Institute, coined the term democratic recession. He counts 25 breakdowns in democracy between 2000 and 2014, either due to military or executive coup or persistent incremental degradation of democratic rights and procedures. This backsliding after a decade of rapid proliferation of liberal democracies following the fall of the Berlin Wall became more apparent when the global financial crisis of 2007-2008 hammered advanced economies, and left millions of ordinary people without homes, jobs, or future prospects. In the meantime, governments were in a race to the bottom to attract and retain wealth by slashing taxes and loosening regulation, while austerity measures eroded government services. What happened next? Populism, or rather the rise of a certain nauseous brand that has little concern for things like facts, logic, or experts. Societies became attracted to the tune of demagogic politicians whose platforms were nebulous at best, but rode people's anger and frustrations by blaming minorities, immigrants, intellectuals, and the establishment. Politics became a binary relationship. It was between us, the majority, against them, whoever else that was outside that group. The early months of the pandemic would have also tilted the balance of support in favor of authoritarian systems, as they seemed to be more effective in containing the virus. In our neighborhood, we contrasted China and Vietnam with India and Indonesia, where individual rights and electoral politics seem to hinder government action. Ladies and gentlemen, as we reflect on the shortcomings of liberal democracy, we should remember that 1, democracy is a means to achieving good governance. That is what the people want. That is the true north, not democracy itself. And 2, that there are different types of democratic systems, and systems need to adapt to changing demands of the people and the environment. The common thread for liberal democracies is that they are built on a system of elections and representation with checks and balances to prevent abuses of power and the tyranny of the majority. Modern liberal democratic states incorporate processes and safeguards to ensure that no single party or community has absolute authority over every aspect of power, and that the rights of all citizens are equally protected. This is the ideal. Yet throughout the history of the modern state, we have witnessed atrocities and discrimination in countries professing to be liberal democracies. History is replete with instances in which democratic institutions and processes have paved the way for crimes against humanity cheered on by the majority. Most famously, Adolf Hitler managed to win power in what was ostensibly a democratic system. Liberal democracy isn't an end in itself and must never be taken for granted. Political scientists debate at length as to the reasons for the recent democratic recession. Ultimately, though, it boils down to public frustration with the governance outcomes it has produced, especially in the mother states of liberal democracy, the United States and the United Kingdom. One of the more interesting and for me compelling factors has been the failure of the main political parties to deliver good leadership options. Ironically, the further democratization of political parties, Democrats and Republicans, Conservatives and Labour, has placed the selection of leaders mainly in the hands of party ideologues and operatives who dominate the voter base, whereas in the past, party elders tended to have the final say and were able to filter candidates. How will democracy thrive again? Western liberal democracy has proved resilient over centuries through many challenging moments such as world wars, McCarthyism, foreign intervention, and financial crisis. And this time, the system will have to evolve again to deliver better, more effective and inclusive governance. There will be reforms to electoral processes and political parties, and perhaps wider embrace of innovations like deliberative democracy, which I will come to later. And when all is said and done with COVID-19, I think we will reflect on the pandemic as a triumph of open liberal systems over closed authoritarian ones, be it because of the lack of transparent handling in Wuhan during the early weeks of the pandemic, or the fact that the most effective vaccines and therapies are developed in the more open Western economies. To quote Condoleezza Rice in her book on the history of Western democracies, every new democracy has near-death experiences, crucible moments when the institutional framework is tested and strengthened or weakened by its response. What these events and crises offer are opportunities to take stock and determine whether formal protections continue to serve their purpose and whether the different spheres of power and authority are in balance, and what can be done to improve and strengthen liberal democracies. Now, ladies and gentlemen, in contrast to the track record of the West, that for democratic resilience and evolution for young and plural societies like ours doesn't make good reading. In their groundbreaking 1970 book, Politics in Plural Societies, A Theory of Instability, Alvin Rabushka and Kenneth Shapsel argue that, and I quote, Most independent plural societies fail to retain over a sustained period stable democratic politics. Free and open competition for people's vote is simply not viable in an environment of intense ethnic preferences. The demand-generating activity of ambitious leaders and concomitant salience of primordial sentiments and the politics of outbidding weaken commitment to national values. They go on to list many new democracies that have broken down, including Malaysia in the riots of 1969, just 3 years before they published their work. Unlike many developing countries they listed that went on to have frequent breakdowns or long periods of authoritarian rule, Malaysia boldly underwent major reforms to its Westminster system and proceeded to enjoy many years of peace, stability, high economic growth, and rapid poverty alleviation. The post-1970 system included affirmative action policies and served to rebalance wealth between communities and also government by grand coalition. These reforms, brought out of necessity, were not designed to last indefinitely. In the case of the new economic policy, there was even a 20-year term limit. This national reset took place over 50 years ago, and even though so much has changed for Malaysia and Malaysians, the system remains substantially in place. Most concerning is the fact that the reforms and the new system have had negative side effects, such as heightened corruption, the hardening of identity politics, and concentration of power. These are at the heart of the systemic dysfunctions that led Malaysia to enter the pandemic with pre-existing conditions: slow economic growth, endemic corruption, high talent outflow, and persistent intercommunal tensions, and ultimately to the unfortunate tale of our handling of the pandemic that I described earlier. Malaysia has desperately needed systemic reform for many years, and it isn't as if our leaders haven't tried. Abdullah Badawi, Najib, and Mahathir 2.0 promised extensive reforms at the beginning of their administrations, but failed to achieve material change. Why? Because the system is resistant to change, and vested interests tend to quickly wrap race or religious labels around change ideas. We saw this not just with Najib's needs-based affirmative action, but also reforms as benign as Pakatan Harapan's proposal to recognize UEC and sign ICERD. On the same vein, over the years, I have seen many good people enter politics with the most noble of intentions, but find themselves having to compromise their values and principles just to stay in the game. So how then do we move forwards? I believe that we should look to our past for the path to a better future. In 1970, a National Consultative Council was set up to deliberate on the causes of the riots and reforms to the system. The NCC comprised 67 representatives of various groups, as well as thought leaders, who met regularly, debated robustly in safe spaces, and found intergroup compromises that they could sell to their communities and constituents. Ironically, in today's parlance, NCC was a form of deliberative democracy, offline, independent, representative platforms of mainly non-politicians. This is something that more and more countries have been adopting recently. Last year, the OECD identified 289 such platforms across the world set up to supplement parliamentary democracy, typically in dealing with structural reforms and other matters deemed unsuited for resolution in partisan political settings of parliaments. At the Irish Citizens' Assembly of 2016, for instance, 99 people debated the issue of legalizing abortion and tabled the recommendation to legalize abortion to Parliament. Prior to the Assembly, polls showed that only 23% of the population would have voted for it. A skeptical Parliament decided to still send the recommendation for referendum and was shocked to find 2/3 of the population voting in favor. The moral of the story is either how detached Parliament can be from genuine public sentiment, or that deliberative democracy as a process itself can help converge views where partisan politics tend to thrive on division. Plural societies should turn to deliberative democracy because when reforms are considered in isolation and political settings, they quickly get labeled as being better or worse for one community or other. Deliberating reforms holistically in non-partisan settings would enable compromises and solutions to be found, For instance, vernacular schools and affirmative action may be best reformed together. And similarly, Ideas has done great work on political funding reform, but how do you move forwards on that without also addressing the excessive concentration of power in the Prime Minister's office, institutional balance, and the role of government in business? I am convinced that a new deliberative platform, which I have coined as the Better Malaysia Assembly, is the only way we can materially reset the trajectory of our nation. We need to gather a representative group of the great, good, and ordinary to first reaffirm the principles of Malaysian nationhood and our implicit social contracts, then revisit how our democracy, institutions, and social economy should work before coming up with specific policy and legislative reform proposals. Its recommendations should then be tabled to Parliament. In conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, whilst liberal democracy as a philosophy for governance has undoubtedly suffered setbacks in recent years, I think it will prove its resilience by evolving as it has in the past. There will be many more variants of the system, but fundamentally, liberal democracy has the best record of sustained good governance. Malaysia's problems lie in its version, not its embrace of liberal democracy. The version we have, our 2.0, was not meant to endure for so long. We need a 3.0. We have needed a 3.0 for some time. We are not a failed state, but we are a nation in decline, and basic physics tells us that things accelerate on the downslope. I have put forward the idea of a Better Malaysia Assembly as the best means to get to a better Malaysia, and I am shamelessly canvassing for support for this idea. Thank you. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you once again, Dato Sri, for the keynote speech. As I said earlier on, Dato Sri is willing to take some questions, but let me just reflect onto some of your discussions before, Dato Sri. Now, in one of the ways to move forward as a nation is to explore on this Better Malaysia Assembly. I mean, could you enlighten us more about this Better Malaysia Assembly? Is it a group or a coalition of the willing that would like to project more on policy discourses or government reforms? What are the niche areas that this Better Malaysia Assembly should focus on? Because I mean, reforms has many agenda, it has many rooms, it has many doors, and we can't just lump everything into a single basket. So what would be in your foresight would be the short term goals or the long-term goals, and how do we move from one point to another? Dato Sri.
Thank you. Well, firstly, I think what I'm looking at is a deliberative platform, as I said, of the good, the great, and the ordinary. If you look at deliberative platforms across the world, there are many forms, and typically one has a mix of intellectuals, community leaders, and ordinary public. In some cases, there is a process of sortition, sort of random selection of people to be part of a deliberative platform. I think in our case, it shouldn't be too different from the way we operated in 1970. There is an offline platform. It is closed door deliberations. If you look at, I was trying to research what happened in NCC, and you actually cannot get minutes from the meeting. They purposely kept away from taking minutes so people could speak, could say their piece as they wished. And in terms of issues, I think we need to obviously revisit the foundations of being Malaysian. This would include Rukun Negara, and I think Abidin point out the issue of Rukun Negara talking about a liberal nation, and yet our politicians tell us that liberalism is a bad word. Which one is it? We have many contradictions in our constitution, in Rukun Negara, etc. There's also tensions like between Islamic law and civil law and so on. These are principles that, and to deal with this, you need to start with the basic principles. What sort of nation are we? Then from there, I think you can then discuss the various critical issues that, you know, are kind of bane of our society. And this, there's a long list here, and one would include institutional balance. One of the issues we have with endemic corruption in this country is the fact that power is so concentrated. And, you know, when you have election commission as well as the anti-corruption agency reporting to the prime minister, it's a bit like, you know, playing football and the winning team actually controls the referee. Yeah, that's not right. We need the independence. And forgive me, but, you know, I think in our structure, how independent is Parliament? That is one question one has to ask. Because in many respects, once a political party is dominant in Parliament, the executive is dominant in Parliament, it also controls Parliament to some extent. And I think it's much more effective if we create a different, a total separate institution to basically oversee those kind of referees to political competition. And we should also look, of course, the issue that Ideas always dives into, which is the issue of business and government's role in the economy, and how you separate that. If you look at what's happened in Malaysia, I mean, I say that we don't have an economy, we have a political economy, right? Because of the involvement, heavy involvement of government in the economy, but also, you know, the most recently, the appointments of all GLCs are really politically driven. So these kind of issues, I think, needs to be dealt with holistically. Then I think you've got the big, you know, issues like affirmative action, vernacular schools, etc. You know, what sort of nation do we want to be? I don't think we can even dream of removing those two immediately, but when? You know, when are our kids going to go to school together? When are we not going to have affirmative action, right? These are questions we have to ask, and then set the path of reform, whether that's going to be 2030 or 2050. When are people going to be born and just be recognized as Malaysian? Is it tomorrow? Is it in 5 years, 10 years? These are the issues I think a deliberative platform like this can discuss. And you know, when you have platforms like this in a plural society, you can have compromises, right? You can have your deal.
Okay.
One community gets this, another community gets that. So that's what I envisage of this deliberative platform.
But isn't it the question of when is not even bravely able to be pointed out? I mean, people are not even wanting to utter the word when are we ready, because from the observations that we have, I mean, people are just so comfortable at having the vernacular tools at the moment. So even asking when that everything will be assimilated into one would make people go very panicky and not very much receptive. What do you think, Dato Sri?
Sure. I mean, I think that's it. I mean, I think it's these are very sensitive issues. And if you discuss it in the political terrain, it gets very emotive. That's why I think you need a closed door setting. People speak their mind, and you can debate this issue. In 2016, 25 of us sat in a setting in Oxford, actually. I called it Conversations in Malaysia. And we discussed all these sensitive issues. And I realized then that, look, you know, some of these people in the room, if they were set in Malaysia with their political affiliations, would say very different things. But in a setting where you take away those affiliations and you say, let's just think what's best for Malaysia. Well, let's start with the principles of what sort of nation we want, and then let's then think what we need to do to achieve those things that we want, right? And then suddenly I found, you know, people were actually debating, people were actually coming together, people were actually understanding one another. And Stanford today has even a center of deliberative democracy, where they're actually studying deliberative platforms as a tool, right, for resolving these kind of contentious issues, for bringing people of, you know, very divergent views together, better understanding each other, and come together for compromises. Yeah, so I think, you know, these issues need to be discussed. I mean, I was with Tun Musa the other day, and he was very sad. He was said, look, I remember when we started this, we talked about building a Malayan nation, and then it became a Malaysian nation. What happened to that? Since then, we've been, living together but growing apart. What's happened to the nation building project, right? We've have a lot of lip service like One Malaysia and so on and so forth, but the reality is, what is the progress of this nation that we're trying to build?
Right. I think that it will set out the mood as well as set out the agenda that will follow from just having that what is best for Malaysia and what sort of nations that we want to achieve in the future. Dato, so we have some questions. I'll try to get all these questions out before we end the session at 12 sharp. There's an opinion by Jing Min Wu. Now, it is my opinion that affirmative action policies inherently breed corruption and are beyond reform. Would it ever be considered to be gotten rid of? I think you've discussed this before, Dato Sri, that this kind of thing that should be put on the table should be started to be discussed in a very academic and professional manner. So I think the difficulties of this opinion is that there are some people who are propagates towards affirmative actions to stay. There are some people in the community that thinks otherwise. I think the question is, how do we actually converge these different sets of communities into one big discussion that what is best for us as Malaysia in the future? Would you comment on that, Dato Sri?
Sure. I think it is true that affirmative action in the way that it was implemented has given rise to a lot of corruption. I mentioned in my speech the side effects of the reforms. Let's be clear. In NCC came up with basically 4 major structural reforms. 1 was the NEP, 2 was Rukun Negara, 3 was the sedition laws, and 4 was the formation of the Grand Coalition government. Those were the 4 elements, right? Taken together, it was a national reset, right? We took the Westminster system, we reset it, right? And those actually did the job in the early years, right? We needed to stabilize the country. We needed peace and stability in order to grow, et cetera, and rebalance and so on. But it's very clear that those reforms had negative side effects. I am critical, say NEP. I said one criticism of NEP was you brought in so much state into the economy, but you didn't evolve anti-corruption frameworks sufficiently, for instance. So very clear, you're right. But I think to say that affirmative action inherently is corrupt or gives rise to corruption is not right also. Yeah, and if you look at the new economic model, it talks about needs-based affirmative action, where you take affirmative action on behalf of those that need. The problem with our NEP was very quickly, there was this obsession with the 30% target. And it was, and I think it was, much of it was because of vested interests. And if you read my book, I actually take you to fairly extreme, ridiculous ways that 30% target was implemented / abused, right? Including the indiscriminate way, shares were always underpriced and given to specific individuals. I describe instances where I was the officer involved in dishing out these shares to people who I didn't know, but I couldn't figure out why am I told to dish out shares to individuals when I should be giving out shares to PNB, right? Or Tabung Haji in the interest of large numbers of Bumiputra, for instance.
I see. All right. I think in the last 5 minutes before 12, we would like you to talk more about the books, like give us some teaser about the book that is coming out in November. There is one comment from Sarojini Pasupati. It is an excellent idea, Dato Sri, about the formation of this platform. I think she's referring to the Better Malaysia initiative, but Dato, a manifesto has to be pre-stated so that no one is left behind, especially on the minorities in race and gender. All wrong has to be corrected and must have the principles and courage to change this. So I think in terms of race and gender, I think the questions wants us to go back and to correct what is wrong and the courage to change what the country possibly have gone wrong when it comes to racist agenda. So do you see that there is a need that for us to reverse back and rectify what is wrong? Or do you think that perhaps we should learn from the mistakes and learn from the past and then create a more constructive, sustainable, and more effective policies and stance when it comes to race and gender? Onto you, Dato Sri.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important that we learn from the past, we learn from our mistakes. But I think it's never ending if we're going to look back and make amends for the past. I think if you look at, I was reading about how much it was going to be cost the U.S. government to pay reparations for slavery, for instance, right? This kind of reparations for the past are very, very difficult and extremely contentious. And I worry that if we spend time trying to do that, then it's a never-ending argument, because the other side of the argument was, of course, affirmative action was needed because of colonial policies, right? Segregation policies, etc. So it's a never-ending debate, and I don't think it's a very useful debate. I think what's important is we basically start recognizing that we're trying to build a Malaysian nation here, and eventually, I think everybody must be treated the same. When is that eventually? How that will take place, and so on. I think this platform is important, because I think people with views such as this need to come together and listen to all sides, and then come to a compromise that again can be sold to the public at large.
I think the imminent challenge that we have is that people are so divisive these days, and we are so segmented when it comes to us being Malaysians. What sort of a nations that we want to have in the future is different from someone else's what sort of nations that we want to have for the future. And I do agree that we need to have a discussion on it, and more on focus group discussion should be built on this. But again, as long as we have all these kinds of diverse opinions and they have their own supporters and their own rallies, isn't it that it will just, I don't know, bring us nowhere? Though that idealistic is what should have in a democracy, but given the context that everyone is so divisive in its opinion, do you think that this is something workable in the next few years?
So when I describe about the Irish Citizens Assembly, I think the point I was trying to make there is, it started off with 78% of the public against abortion. Right? They went through this intense period of deliberations at the Citizens Assembly on this issue. People with these from all sides came and discussed, right? They heard each other, and it had a tremendous effect of kind of converging people on the same view. And when it came out of it, 66% of the public voted for legalizing abortion. Look at the swing, right? So I actually think that when you bring people with extreme views together, and actually they talk about each other and they can listen to one another and understand things that they may not have. I mean, sometimes people get very, angry, upset, simply because they don't listen. They don't bother to research. They ignore facts. They go to the echo chambers online, right? And don't bother to hear the other side. And this is actually very interesting. The research has come out of Stanford. Why it's so important that, people, you have someone to mediate, and you have people from all sides meeting each other, having lunch together, and then debating about issues. And suddenly, you get this convergence. But of course, you put it in a parliamentary setting when people are, playing to the gallery, positioning themselves for the next election. It's not very useful. Yeah, it is very real that deliberative democracy is evolving because of frustrations with representative democracy in the West. They're saying that, okay, Parliament can we elected you, you can focus on these things that are more short-term, more immediate, and government, etc. But for long-term structural issues, it's not for you. We take it offline in a deliberative platform. the reality is you vote for someone for 4 to 5 years to represent you on every issue. In reality, they vote in parliament according to what they're instructed by their party whip or what is best for them in the next election. That's the reality, right? So why not Malaysia think of this having a deliberative platform, since that's actually where many advanced democracies are heading anyway. And and lo and behold, we were actually innovators in deliberative democracy because in 1970.
Right. Okay. I guess this is what Ilya is asking. Listen to all sides. How will this be started? So I think that also have just mentioned it ago by having this deliberative setup to talk about these issues. Now, I think there is one last question before we would like to hear more about the book that you are launching in November. Nur Azra Saad says, and I think this is what you've also mentioned a while ago on elections and politicians. So can we have a strict guideline on who can be a candidate during an election, same as when we hire someone to fulfill a job vacancy? Or Dato' Sri, even if I can just add more to that, how do you see election while you were younger in the 70s and in the 80s? And what possibly has changed in today's general elections kind of setup? And how do we think that we should move forward in the next coming general election? Should we have a strict guideline? Should the expectations be spelled out clearly so that the politicians are aware of what actually be expected from them? Over to you, Dato' Sri.
Well, I think certainly, I think there must be greater transparency in terms of people's credentials. And there must be some process where what people claim, right? There must be a truth barometer when people claim that they've been to Cambridge University. It's not Cambridge International University, right? There must be truth barometers, and I think but there's a limit to what you can do. The public needs to be able to have its full choice. Who is to say that a person doesn't want to be represented by someone who's not educated? Right, but that person who's not educated must, put there that I'm not educated. So people have transparency in terms of one's credentials, one's position, etc. But I think to kind of restrict to say that you must have a PhD in order to go for elections, I wouldn't agree with that.
Thank you. All right, thank you then. Okay, Dato' Sri, we have 6 minutes left before I close off the morning sessions. Can you tell us more about the book so that when it's on release, we'll straightly go to the bookstore and look for your book and have a good read on it in November?
Well, first of all, it isn't an autobiography. It is more a sort of what I saw on the front lines book. So it shares what I saw and understood as a kid in terms of the Tun Razak legacy, and my view that this legacy is misunderstood, and I think we spend too much time defending the tangible parts of the legacy, like the new economic policy, like Felda, Bank Bumi, or whatever, the tangible parts of his legacy. Whereas I think the more important, more enduring, and more relevant part of his legacy are the intangibles. His values, why he did what he did at that time. And actually, in many respects, if you take the intangible part of his legacy, you would actually say the tangible part of his legacy needs to be overhauled. I think if you understand the person, if you understand his pragmatism, his logic, you would probably say that Tun Razak today would say, we need to review the NEP. Right? It's no longer it no longer works for Malaysians today. Yeah. So that's kind of the first part, and the second part is about what I saw as in my 29 career at CIMB, the changes, etc. And a lot of it is, this system that was set up by this Malaysia 2.0 I described, and how that worked, and how CIMB operated within that 2.0 system. Yeah, and it also talks about how, because I was, my brother was in politics. I basically didn't have a choice. I went into banking and I loved it. And then, then it goes on to talk about how in many ways the 1MDB debacle brought me back to politics in some ways. And then talks about, my views on, the nation going forward and what needs to be done. Yeah. So all that is interspersed with actual stories from the front line, what happened. I didn't have all my stories. There is kind of those relevant moments, right, of incidences, etc. But it's not a full autobiography because I think that'd be pretty boring.
Right. Okay. I think at Ideas we can't wait to actually have a read of the book, and we would like to call you more to discuss more on the book itself once we all have read, and let's have a really good discussion about the book in one of our programs. We look forward to that, Dato' Zain. All right, thank you so much, Yang Berbahagia Datuk Sri Nazir bin Tun Haji Abdul Razak for the keynote speech. Our also special thanks to Yang Amat Mulia Tunku Zain Al Abidin bin Tuanku Muhriz for the opening speech earlier on. The forum or the conference, the Liberalism conference, will take a recess and will continue at the afternoon session. The afternoon sessions will be on post-Sheraton, the breakdown of trust and fragility of parliamentary democracy. That will be moderated by Ira Azhari from Ideas Malaysia. So we look forward to visit all of you in the afternoon sessions later on. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, thank you once again for joining us today this morning for the opening and the keynote speech sessions. And I wish everyone a pleasant lunch, and we can't wait to see everyone at the afternoon session. Thank you so much. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.